Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Dr. Avital Hazony Levy. Avital is a doctor of philosophy. She is especially interested in the philosophy of ethics and especially in loyalty. Today, we're going to talk about Avital's ideas and how they relate to our everyday lives. Hello, Avital. How are you?
Good to see you, Doran. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thanks for coming. So, Avital, I understand that much of your thought is directed towards the idea of loyalty, how we should use it, how we should construct our societies around that. So, could you tell us a little bit about, well, your before you start talking about your thesis? Could you tell us about how do you understand loyalty? Like, what do you mean by loyalty, and how does that relate to a state or a group or whatever?
Right. So let's start with a working definition. I think that's the best place to start. So we know that we're on the same page and we know what we're talking about. So when I talk about loyalty, what I'm talking about is a motivation that people have. It's a tendency to act on a certain motivation. And that motivation is to act on behalf of, to support the interests of, to support the flourishing of something that's theirs. Right. So we can have loyalty to a family member. A family member is your sister or your brother, your parent. And when you act with loyalty, you act to promote their flourishing, their success. And often loyalty comes in conflict with other motivations that we have, with other tendencies to act on other motivations, right? So loyalty could come in conflict with self-interest. If we're the kind of person who cares to promote our own honor in the world, our own ability to make money, our own health, our own security, you can promote those for yourself as an individual. That's what we usually call self-interest. And then you can promote those for someone who is part of who you are. It's someone who is a part of how you see yourself, who's part of who you are, and you consider yours. But loyalty is not just the way you think about another person, the way you feel about another person. It really is the way you act. It's about acting in a way that promotes the interests and the flourishing of someone else who's yours. And I think that we see that I think loyalty is something that both in philosophy departments is not studied very much. And in society, I think it's not the first virtue that people will point to if they want to tell you what a good person is. I think we often talk about altruistic goodness, benevolence towards other people. We'll often talk about justice, acting in a way that is just. But loyalty is often frowned upon or even is viewed as suspicious. And I think a lot of my work is to try to show where both in philosophy departments and in our society, we need to understand the centrality of loyalty. It's not just one of many virtues. I think it really is one of the central virtues. So I'll give you an example. It's a very mundane, less philosophical example, but I think that it captures where we are, I think, in the West today. And Israel is a little bit different than other countries on this question, but I think that we have a lot to learn about this. So it's a growing conversation. There's more and more appreciation and realization that birth rates are dropping in the Western countries, right? And this is a very broad phenomena. Israel is an outlier because it hasn't had its birth rate drop below replacement, but in most of the Western countries, that's happening in the last few decades. And it's a very quick change. There's a very good movie that was made about this, a movie called Birth Gap by Stephen Shaw. And he does the research. He goes all around the world, interviews people. And what's interesting that he finds is that many people are not having children, even though they never decide that they didn't want to have children, right? This is not what we think it is, which is people are so interested in making money or succeeding in their profession or health or whatever it is, and they decide that they don't want to have children. Actually, what's happening is that a lot of people think that they're going to have children, but they don't end up having children. And for women, this is because they
Miss the
get to an
train.
age where they
Yeah.
miss the train. They get to an age where they can't have children yet. And for men, it's often because they don't find a spouse. They don't find a woman who they would want to have children with. Right? So
But
a friend of mine.
wouldn't you say that for men, like on a societal level, like if you had a friend who wanted kids and didn't have them because he wouldn't get married, you could say you would describe him to me as, well, he just didn't find anyone. But if you describe it on a societal level, then wouldn't it be better to say, because you don't really owe any you don't owe any politeness to these people because they're statistics essentially. So wouldn't it be better to say that men, for some reason, maybe not their own fault, but for some reason, there's a high rate of men who are not desirable enough to find a spouse? What do you think of that? Or maybe I was,
It's possible. I mean, you could say that the problem is these particular men. I think you're right. I think that there's maybe an age where men are less desirable unless they've made a lot of money or are very famous, right? Those people, maybe those very few people, it's much easier for them, kind of no matter what the age is. But for most of us, age matters on this question. And at some point, a lot of men and women find that they didn't have children even though they wanted to. Now, Israel's an outlier in this. And when I'm interviewed about this in podcasts, people want to say that the reason why Israelis have children is because we have wars, right? And I think that this is a complete misunderstanding. What is actually happening, I think, is that Western societies told this story, which is we are a social contract. We are based on what justifies the governments in our societies, in our countries, is that we were all individuals and we came together and made a contract between us that this is the best for each one of us. So the story that's told is we are each an individual first, and we make a calculation for what's good for us as an individual. And that convinces us to join in a country, in a state that has laws, that makes impositions, that taxes us, but we also get all these benefits. Right? That's a story. Now, Francis Hutcheson, he's one of my favorite philosophers. He, in the 17th century, already warned. He said, look, self-interest is a really strong human motivation. But if you tell the story that that's the main or the only motivation that motivates people, then it takes over. It crowds out other motivations. Now, that's what I think has happened with loyalty. I think people are self-interested. That's a very strong motivation. But people also have two other motivations at least. Right? So Hutcheson thought you could build a whole society built on benevolence. I think he's wrong. I think that really there's a very strong motivation to be loyal. Loyalty is different than both self-interest and different than benevolence. When you're loyal, you prioritize some people who are yours, but you act on their behalf in ways that are often not self-interested. And I think that actually I just want to say that I think that better explains what's happening in Israel, why Israel is an outlier on this issue of birth rates. Because I think Israelis are born into families, into communities, into a whole nation that's small enough so that they feel like it's theirs. And therefore, I think the story that we are all just individuals looking after our self-interest, it doesn't hold as well for Israelis. I mean, we study the same political theory and we live in a liberal democracy. But I think that societally, people think of themselves as born into families, born into communities, born into a tradition, born into a people. And that changes the way they prioritize and make decisions in their lives. They're not really very highly motivated to make decisions only as individuals, right? Of course, that's also part of our motivations. It plays a part. But we also make decisions all the time with loyalty to our family members, our nation, our tradition, our community, our God. Those play a part. And I think that they save us a little bit, because when you're 20 or even 25 or even 28, the interest that you as an individual have in having children seems very far away. It's hard to make the decision to have a child out of self-interest, even though I think it really does benefit each individual long-term to have your own children. I think it does benefit you. But it seems very difficult. And I think that that's what we're seeing in the West, that if people are making the calculation individualistically, they decide not to have children. They put it off, they put it off, they put it off until it's too late, because there's all these other things that self-interestedly they see the much more immediate gain there is. But I think that in Israel, a lot of people are making decisions out of loyalty. They have children, not just because they want a child for themselves. And I think even that's often not what plays the main, is mainly influencing people's decisions. I think they have children because they're part of a big family and they want to contribute to that big family. They've received so much and they want to add, they want to give life, and they're loyal both to their parents, their grandparents, their nation, and even to their children that they're going to have, right? There's something about just giving life to another human being, which you need loyalty for that. You don't need self-interest for that. So I think that's a very real, concrete example where if loyalty is a major virtue that people have, then people will make decisions in a different way. And I think Israelis don't like thinking about this issue because we think, oh, whatever, here we have high birth rates. So why do we need to even think about that? We're just fine on this front. And I think that it is something that Israelis can teach Western countries. You know, in Western countries today, the way they're trying to solve this problem of birth rates, I mean, what are they talking about? They're talking about countries that in 1 or 2 generations are going to have twice as many old people as young people, right? That's a huge burden. But this is not just an individual decision. It's a decision that people make individually, but it's a decision that's influenced by social changes and it has impact on whole countries. And I think that Israel both has something to teach on this issue. It's the difference is not to pour money on people who are having kids. The difference is that people need to think of themselves as part of families, communities, a nation, a tradition, and then then to be motivated to act on the behalf of those things that are part of them. And I think that's where loyalty comes in.
You know, that's interesting because it's an interesting theory because as you were speaking, I was trying to, as I think anyone should do, I was trying to think of ways to find weaknesses, right? Because when you hear a theory, if you know how to think, I would hope that you would immediately start to think, okay, why is this wrong? Why should I accept this? So I was starting to think, okay, maybe the problem is the size of the country. Like take the United States, it's too large. People travel like, you have your parents living in this state and you live in that state. So the distance makes your loyalty, if we were to use your terminology, weaker. But the same low birth rate would also apply to smaller Western countries. And then I thought, okay, maybe
Japan, the low rate is really low.
Yeah, and then I thought to myself, okay, maybe it's the age of the country. Like maybe a country that's relatively new, like a couple of generations old, maybe that's the reason there's such high birth rates. Okay, and then I thought, wait, but Korea. Well, I guess Korea has historically been a nation for a long time, but it's been born. The modern version of Korea was born around the same time that Israel was, right? And they have the lowest birth rates in the world. I think I think they have a fertility rate of about 1.2, which means on average a woman has 1.2 children, which essentially means you're halving the population every generation. It's insane. So actually, I couldn't find many obvious weaknesses with what you've said. But one thing that did come to mind, and I might get a little too philosophical here, so I'll say what I want to say and then I'll explain it. Okay? What if you're saying that what's missing is some sort of loyalty and too much individualism in a sense? But what if we were to take, say, a Aristotelian or Stoic approach and say that responsibility towards the community, which is essentially what you're calling loyalty in a sense, is actually a virtue, and the individual should want to cultivate his virtues, and thus he should want to cultivate his loyalty. So you take the loyalty, which is a sort of collective term, and you apply it to an individual in his own interest, in a sense. It's like you said, that one should have, it's in one's own interest to have children. I can think of like maybe one of the most influential conservative thinkers in the West in the last couple of years, Jordan Peterson. He's been promoting this idea of responsibility, and I think, well, he's promoting it to the individual, but once the individual accepts that responsibility, he becomes what you would call loyal. Isn't that also correct? What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a strong connection between responsibility and loyalty. I think a person who's loyal feels responsible, right? So I think the two go together. But the reason why I emphasize loyalty rather than emphasizing responsibility is because I think responsibility can also be to yourself, right? You can be acting as a responsible adult when you don't drink and drive, right? So the word responsibility in itself doesn't assume that there's someone else involved. And I think the strength of loyalty, I think our psychology really requires that we not be motivated in only on behalf of ourselves, but also on behalf of others. And I think that the pressure that we feel when a family member needs something, or when a friend needs something from us, or when we see that a friend is making really terrible decisions for themselves, and we feel responsible to be critical, to reflect to them that they're making a mistake, right? That kind of sense of responsibility for someone else, I think, is a very central psychological part of being a good human being. And I think that if you just talk about responsibility without saying to who or to what, then I think that you miss something. And I think that there's another aspect, which is loyalty really capitalizes on the fact that human beings have a way of conceiving of other individuals or groups or teams or countries as a part of themselves, right? So when a person who's loyal, who makes the things that are mine are things that I invest in, that kind of person feels exuberant when their country wins in the Eurovision, or if their country is moral rather than being immoral. And the same on the individual level. A person who's loyal will feel proud when their child succeeds, or ashamed if their child does something wrong. Right? You know, I had an instance like just a few days ago where I came to the kindergarten to pick up my daughter, and turned out she and this other kid were beating up another kid. And I felt ashamed. You know, even though it wasn't me who was acting in that way, it was my 2-year-old. But I felt deeply ashamed. And I think those emotions that we usually have towards ourselves, self-interest is a need to promote ourselves, or pride is an enjoyment of our own strengths. Shame is a pain that we have at our own failures. Those emotions actually are able to be extended to other people, other groups, other abstract groups. And I think that we miss something in our understanding of human psychology, that we think that everything that we do is in order to benefit the individual. Actually, our emotions allow for us to extend to include other people's groups, traditions, peoples. And I think that the word responsibility doesn't allow for that. It doesn't allow for that depth, which I think is really there, and we should build up in people.
Yeah, so the reflection of the other on ourselves is really a good something that responsibility doesn't include, right? Also, there's a psychological term for that. If I'm not mistaken, it's called basking in reflected glory. It's like the scientific term for feeling good when your team wins, essentially. Even
right,
though
but I wouldn't even say basking. I would say you just feel proud, right? I think
yeah,
you
that's
feel
the
like
name
it is
though.
your glory.
Yeah, but
right. I'm not contesting the name, but I'm saying I think the more accurate description is you feel like it's yours. You feel like your child's success is your success. Now, there could be bad sides of that, right? If you overstep and you start thinking that it really is yours and not your child's success, right? Or you feel like it's so much yours that you should decide what they do with your lives or whatever. There definitely could be downsides to it, but I also think that there are benefits.
Okay, so I might be getting philosophical again here, but you were actually critiquing, in a sense, the classical tradition of the social contrarians. That's Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, because you're saying, well, the social contrarians, they're essentially thinking that we should enter the social contract because that's for our own benefit. So that's too individualistic and selfish in a sense, and it's not driven by loyalty as it should be. But what comes to what I'm thinking about is, as you're speaking, is Rousseau, essentially. Because Rousseau, the way I understand Rousseau, and I didn't hear many people give that description of him, but I did hear some. What he says essentially is our social communities have corrupted us in a sense. We used to be noble savages, and now we're this dreadful thing who only thinks about competing with one another, and it's horrible, or something like that. And the solution to that, according to Rousseau, is actually one of two options. Either you find a way to live as a kind of savage, which is what he does in his book Emile on education. He tells that story about like this guy who lives in society, but he's also kind of a savage or something like that, like something in between. That's the first option. The second option is to find some way to make the social group be devoid of any competition, like to make all of our interests align. So in that sense, he is both an anarchist and a fascist, in a sense, right? Because he says, listen, either throw the state away or make your group into such a solidified being that you all share interests. Now, your thesis, what you've been presenting, and you probably heard this 1,000 times by now. What is really different here from groupthink, right? Because you can say, okay, so I am going by people who share my nationality, and then that leads you to fascist. Like, that's the best group, that's the most important group, that this is what I should be loyal to. Or you could say, well, I'm loyal to my class. Obviously, odds are I'm in the working class, and that leads me to communism, right? Because I want the proletarian to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, what you would call, that's what Lenin established in the Soviet Union. Or maybe you could say, well, I'm loyal actually to my race, and then you get Nazism. Right. So how first of all, how do you dispense with that sort of criticism? How do you respond to that? And what is the correct group to be loyal to?
So I think what's important to emphasize is that I don't think that loyalty dictates to you what's right and wrong. I think loyalty is an important virtue. It's the way we should act in the world. We should act with virtue. But there is an objective. Are you really furthering the interests of the object of loyalty, or are you failing to? In the same way, there's an objective question. Is your object of loyalty good or bad? And the fact that you're acting to promote it and maybe trying to improve it morally too, I think that's a part of being loyal. It does not mean that the object is good or bad. So if you're a loyal son, it doesn't mean that your father is a good person. Right? And then I think that loyalty does allow to ask and to motivate yourself to ask, what is this object of loyalty like? And being a loyal person, I don't think requires certain beliefs about the object of loyalty. It requires that you'll be motivated to prioritize, to further the interest, and even to sacrifice for the object of loyalty. It doesn't assume that you think that the object of loyalty is good. And I think that leaves open the question of, so who should you be loyal to? Right? The other, I think, important part of this is that loyalty, I don't think, assumes that you have a single object of loyalty. And I think that this is where loyalty actually is very important in a way that the Rousseau theory maybe doesn't allow for, which is loyalty assumes conflict. There are going to be conflicts between your self-interest and the interests of the person or group or tradition that you're loyal to, right? And being loyal does not assume that there's a complete overlap of interests. The opposite, it assumes that sometimes you're going to sacrifice, but the very fact that we talk about sacrifice and loyalty means that we know that there isn't a complete overlap of interest. There's a conflict. And saying that we think that people should be loyal does not mean that we kind of ignore or pretend to not see the conflicts and the sacrifices anymore. We just think that it's better for society and better for individuals to be trying to work with others, to be working on behalf of others, and hopefully that's also mutual. And then I think that what we aim for is for people to work together with other people in teams, in groups, in larger institutions, but also that part of that working on behalf of and working with someone is also being able to criticize, is being able to evaluate. And I think that the metric for right or wrong is not the object of loyalty. It's not whatever your parent or your child or your nation or your tradition says is always right or always wrong, is always right just because you're loyal to them. The loyalty is we are working together. I am working on your behalf. I'm working to improve and promote you. And the fact that you're that kind of person, you are a loyal person, puts pressure on you to say, well, it better be that the one I'm loyal to is worthy of the sacrifices, the commitment, the efforts, the initiative that I'm putting in, right? So then you have to ask, well, who should I be loyal to? Now, I do think that if you have a worldview where you don't just do what's right and wrong, you do what's right and wrong, but you also have a virtue of being loyal, then there's this interplay between I want to do what's right, but I want to do what's right, especially for those who I'm loyal to. I want to do what's right, but I'm especially prioritizing those that are good. And I think that interplay is actually important. So there's a tendency to try to explain moral philosophy based on just one principle, right? So utilitarians will say it's just utility, or Kantian will say it's just rationality, or it's just freedom, right? And I think that actually a more robust and more accurate view of moral philosophy says you need competing principles that will be in conflict with each other, but that conflict is healthy. It's not a weakness, it's a strength. Because the problem is if human beings try to boil all of moral decisions, all of moral thinking, all of moral judgment to one principle, then no one principle fits. And then you're actually making very, very big mistakes. So what I'm proposing is that it's healthy, that on the one hand, you're trying to seek what's good. You're trying to figure out what's right. You're trying to figure out what's just. But on the other hand, you do that with other people that you prioritize, other people that you think are more important than others. You do this with other people that you're trying to figure out with them what's right and wrong. And that those two principles together actually make for a better moral theory than just one. So you probably heard of Jonathan Haidt. He has a book about the righteous mind, right? About the conflict between what he calls kind of weird Western moral thinking and what he thinks is more traditional thinking. And what he says is that in a more traditional thinking, there are actually 6 principles of morality. It's not just the freedom and fairness that we find in liberal societies today, but there's also things like purity, and there's also something like loyalty, right? So you see there in the studies that he does, he goes to more traditional societies and he says there's a basic moral principle of being loyal which can't be reduced to doing what's fair, doing what's just. It's a different moral principle, but it's in competition, in tension with, but therefore I think it actually contributes to living a better moral life. So what I'm suggesting is, okay, let's be more concrete, right? Because this has all been very abstract. So what I'm suggesting is, let's say you want to be a good person. So you could think, just do whatever is benevolent, do whatever is good-hearted, whatever is good for others all the time, right? So you would just kind of randomly do good things for random people you run into all the time. I'm
Right,
saying no.
that's Peter Singer, right?
Right. I think that I think the criticism is no, there's some relationships that are more special to you, that are yours, that you're more invested in, and some relationships that are less, right? So maybe you will give out of kindness, you will give charity to someone who's really in need, but there are other people that you're going to be so much more invested in them. You're going to give so much more. What you give to your children or you give to your close friends, or what you're willing to sacrifice for your nation is on a complete different scale. It's something that you would never be able to do for everyone, but is incredibly more valuable than what you would do if you were just trying to be kind to everyone. And I think that balancing those two is really important.
Are you familiar with Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene?
A little bit.
Okay, so there's this idea put forth in that book. I might actually be mistaken, but I think it's from The Selfish Gene. And that idea claims that the reason you would be, it's actually evolutionarily beneficial to be loyal and to prioritize your group because it has more of your DNA in it. So essentially by preserving your family and your extended community in a sense, you're actually acting according to, well, your evolutionary dictates, let's say. So as you were speaking, I was actually thinking to myself, well, what you're essentially describing is that that age-old principle of, there's my tribe and there's the tribe across the river, and I should be more loyal to my tribe than to the other tribe, even if we're on friendly terms. And we should both be even less loyal to, the other tribe. And that also reminds me of, I think there's a famous saying in Arabic that goes around in the Middle East, and it says, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my cousin against the stranger, something like that. So is that essentially what you're saying?
So I think that there is benefits to the individual when the individual is a loyal person. I think they're really, that's what we were talking about in the first question about birthright. So I think it's better for individuals to be parents long term. If you think back on their whole lives, most human beings will be happier that they had children than those who will regret having children. But I think that what Dawkins is, right, he has the benefit of talking about genes. I think that in that sense, to describe a loyal person as doing what they're doing for the other person as self-interest, I think is just inaccurate psychologically. I think that when a person invests in their child or in their friend or is willing to go fight in the military and maybe die, those people, when they act out of loyalty, are not thinking, well, this is the best thing for me. So I think it would be a lie to tell ourselves, well, we can just promote self-interest and people will figure out that it's the best for them to be loyal. I think that's just not an accurate description of what happens. What happens is that when people act on behalf of their child, on behalf of their nation, what they have before their eyes, the object of their action, their motivation is to benefit their family member or their nation, right? Not themselves. So I think you could explain why this is also beneficial for the individual, but that's us looking at it from the outside and analyzing it because we have some perspective about long term, what are going to be the effects of this action. But when you're in the moment, when you're making the decision, what's motivating you is the other person, is your nation. It's not yourself. And therefore, I think we can't reduce loyalty to selfishness. I think it's not an accurate description of our psychology, of the way we're motivated, even if there are benefits, right? So again, I'll go back to Francis Hutchinson, and he says, he is arguing against Hobbes' view that human beings are basically selfish. And he says, look, it's true that there are benefits to the individual for being benevolent, for being kind. It's true that we have a pleasure from being kind to others, but it's an inaccurate description of what motivates us. When we're motivated to give charity to someone on the street, we're not motivated by, I will have pleasure from this, even though that's true that there is that side effect. And I think that that's exactly the same argument that you need to make about loyalty. It's just an inaccurate description to reduce loyalty to self-interest, even if Dawkins is right that ultimately it's beneficial even for the individual gene.
Yeah, he would say that it's beneficial not to you but to your gene. I think that's what he would say. But I would actually I've read the book so long ago that I don't even know if I can properly represent it. It just came to mind.
Right. Well, and I think that that's a tendency to try to reduce everything to self-interest. This reflects what I was saying at the beginning, that we live in societies that tell the story of a contract theory that starts with individuals. So Dawkins just takes it one step further and he says, well, it's not the individual, it's the individual gene, but I think it's the same tendency. And I think that even if he's right that he can show that on the level of genes, I think that's not true on the level of human psychology. But now I lost the other point that you raised. After you were talking about Dawkins. About tribalism. Yeah. Okay. So I think you're absolutely right. Then when we're looking from the perspective of Western society, which today is in a place where it's emphasizing individualism, I think to an extreme extent, and I think also to a harmful extent, then the response that I think that we need is to reintroduce loyalty, which means to reintroduce the ability of human beings, not just to act with kindness, but to prioritize those who are theirs, right? So in that sense, I think I am suggesting that the Western world, Western societies need to move in the direction of being more tribal. Yes, in the direction of remembering what it's like to prioritize those who are yours. And I think that Singer has done very good work in pushing in the opposite direction from what I'm suggesting, right? So I'm glad you mentioned him. I mean, when I was at Princeton, he was kind of a guru. All these students loved.
Wait. We didn't introduce him to our viewers and listeners. So in a few words, do that. I think you would do a better job at it than me. So.
Okay, so Peter Singer is a moral philosopher at Princeton University, and he's written in a utilitarian vein, right? In this tradition that says that we need to maximize utility, but he's taken it further maybe than most other utilitarians did before. And he really emphasizes that there's complete equality when you make a utilitarian calculation, when you're making a decision that tries to maximize utility, you should maximize utility of all. And he's extended that not just to human beings, which was kind of the accepted common view among utilitarians, but rather he's extended it to all sentient beings. So any being that can suffer should be will have equal status in your calculation as a utilitarian. And this means that he thinks that you should really do for those who are suffering the most, right? So there's so many things I disagree with Singer, but I think the one thing to notice is that the strongest motivator for you, and when you're trying to decide what to do, is to alleviate suffering, and that really puts a lot of pressure on refocusing your life in the direction of finding those in the universe that are suffering the most, rather than prioritizing those that are close to you, those are yours, who you may be able to do much more than just alleviating their suffering, right? And there was a pushback against what I was going to say is that I just want to say that this is, I think, has been a really attractive theory for many young people. When I was at Princeton, all these students were just looking to be told what it means to be a good person, right? So we live in I think, in a society where a lot of professors kind of in the tradition of we're neutral and we're not here to tell you what to do, every individual can come up with the truth on their own, really avoided giving moral guidance. And I saw that so many students, they wanted to be good people. They wanted someone to tell them, here's an argument for the way you should live as a good person. So students flocked to him. They would invite him to come and speak, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom, because he gave them a moral view of how they can improve themselves as people. He would say, look, commit yourself to give $50 or to give 10% of your money. That was really his goal to those who are most suffering on the planet Earth. And students really were attracted to that. They wanted to hear that. And so what I was saying is that I think that part of the attraction is that people want to be good, but I think that the outcome of the theory is that really there's, Singer will make room. Once you push back, then he'll say, yes, of course you should do something for your family. Yes, of course you should do something for your neighbor. But it's not in the framework of his theory. I mean, when you read his book, there's chapters about how you should care for the environment and how you should care for the poor. There's no chapter about how you should care for your parents. There's no chapter about how you should care for your children. There's no chapter about being a nationalist and caring for your nation, right? So that means that even if he can make some utilitarian calculation that allows for this, it's not in the framework of his theory that prioritizing those who are yours is a virtue, right? That being loyal is a virtue. It's an important part of being a good person. It's not a side issue. It's not kind of an afterthought. What I'm suggesting is that we have to completely rethink, right? Utilitarians think that equality among all beings will bring you to the most moral decision. And I'm saying, no, I think that you need to think what's right and wrong. This is where we need some pushback on the tribalism, because tribalists, all they have is loyalty. Right? And when I'm suggesting, look, loyalty is missing from Western society, in philosophy and in society, what I'm saying is we need to add it. I'm not saying that it should replace all of morality. And I think in a tribal society, right and wrong is decided by what's needed, what's good for your tribe. That's all there is to it. And there's no need to evaluate the goodness or the moral character of your tribe, because that's the highest loyalty you have. So I'm definitely not suggesting that. I think that I'm a Humean in this, that I think that we have a moral appreciation for what is good. When we see that something's good, we appreciate that. When we see that someone acts in a way that's good, we have a pleasure from that. And when we see that someone acts with viciousness, with cruelty, we have a disgust for that. And I think that does not mean that all human beings that have it all the time, but I think it is part of human psychology. I think that's where morality comes from that approval that we have. But I don't think that that's enough to be a good person, is just to go on whatever you as an individual morally approve of all the time. And I think that's where loyalty needs to be balanced. I think that you need to prioritize those who are yours, but then you also need this moral approval in order to be able to evaluate them and the society you live in and yourself. So just because you're being loyal, it doesn't mean that you're being good. but loyalty is an important part of being good. That's the way I would put it.
Okay, so that actually connects quite well to what you would call the origin of Western culture, in a sense, because you could say that the origin is some sort of connection between what you might call the spirit of Jerusalem and the spirit of Athens, or something like that. So if you were to have this connection and you go to the early European cities, I've actually lived in Europe for quite some time. I've lived in many different cities across Europe, and the archetypical European city is always built the same. You have a large church or cathedral that's in the center of the city, and it's as beautiful as possible. And it's filled with all the beautiful things. Like, I know I'm being maybe too abstract here, but think about what this means, right? It's the center of community. It's the most beautiful and the most impressive, and it's filled with all the beautiful things. And around it, everything else is built, right? And so that's the community, that's the loyalty, in a sense, and the common values, which are at the center and always the most beautiful. Now, this community is built around Jesus, in a sense, or as the central figure of this idea. And the story of Jesus is that the reason that he was sent and then crucified is that God loves every human being so much that he was willing to make that sacrifice, right? Something approximating that. And so you get both in this archetypical European city, you get both the individualism and the loyalty to the community, because the individualism comes from, well, essentially the idea that every person that you come across in the street is so precious to God, to the almighty creator of the universe, that he was willing to die on the cross for him, right? Every single person. And so that's the individual. And the community is essentially, well, the church, or the system of unifying belief. And you've just said that people are so thirsty to think about, well, what's the right thing to do? That's a relatively new problem. Nietzsche diagnosed it as the death of God, right? That's how you need new morals, essentially. And he was trying to present a couple of new morals, but I guess Nietzsche was better at breaking down things than he was at building them. So he was able to break everything down, or point at the breakage. I don't know if he actually was the one to break it, but he wasn't able to build anything new, although I guess he was hoping to. So that's where we're at.
I'm really happy that you brought that up, because I'm not an expert at Christianity, and I don't think that my starting point is going to be rebuilding from Christian sources or from the Christian churches, even though I think the Christian societies, maybe they used to be Christian and maybe need to go back to that. Maybe they can do that work. But I am working together with a few colleagues. We're working on a course on the political theory of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. And I think that loyalty is a major theme of the Hebrew Bible. I think that it's not so much a major theme for Aristotle, right? I think that Aristotle's political theory is not so much built on loyalty. But I think that the Hebrew Bible is. So if the same way that you described Christianity in a few words, I'll just say in a few words where I see that this appears. We could go much into it, but we also could do a whole hour just talking about that. And there's many more ideas in the Hebrew Bible than just loyalty. I'm not going to reduce it to my idea, right? But I think that it is a theme. I think that in the Hebrew Bible, God creates the world and he sees goodness in it. And he brings human beings in. He instructs them to have children, to multiply, and to rule. And in that, he thinks that human beings are going to be allies. They're going to be they're going to work with God to make the world a good place. And it turns out that it doesn't work well, right? It fails. First, it fails because human beings are so corrupt. They even corrupt the earth, they corrupt the animals, and then we have a flood. And after that, God gives laws to human beings. He says, don't kill each other, don't eat meat, right? So he gives them these laws. But it turns out that doesn't work so well either, because their response to that is to try to build a big building and try to compete with God and rebel against God. They don't want to follow the law. even though the law is don't murder. They don't want to follow it, right? They want to rebel. And the third, after God first tries just an alliance with all human beings, and then he tries, let's give all human beings laws. And that doesn't work either. What God sees is the human beings want to make a name for themselves. That's why they build the building. They want to be famous. They want to be remembered. They want the glory that you were mentioning before. They want to feel like something is theirs and they're remembered because it's theirs. And one option is to build a big building that's going to last forever. And then you say, look, that's me. I succeeded because of this building. And the compromise that God makes in Genesis and Bereshit is to say, look, human beings need, in order to be good, they need to feel invested that something is theirs. If they have room to receive honor and glory because something is theirs, they're more likely to be good in the way that God wanted them to be originally than they are if you just give them laws and there's no glory and no name in it. And that's the compromise that God makes. And therefore he makes an alliance with Abraham and he founds a nation. He chooses a particular family and he says, this particular family is going to grow. It's going to have all these tribes and it's going to turn into a nation of tribes with all this diversity in it, right? It's not the uniform Rousseauian general will. It's a family with all these individuals, and that family grows to have all these different tribes that have conflicting interests. But God suggests we're going to have loyalty of God to this family, to this nation, and he expects loyalty in return, right? So it says in various places, it says in Deuteronomy and Devarim that God is Hayla Ne'eman, he's the loyal God. And it says about Abraham that God found him loyal. And so about David that God found him to be loyal. And I think what the theme is, right? This is not everything in the Bible, but it is one theme, is that that human beings, because of their need to feel like something is theirs, that they're invested, that they feel great because something is succeeding that's theirs, then the best way to achieve a just and good society, and ultimately, I think also a just and good world, I think this model is meant to be a blessing to the other nations, is to teach people to seek to improve their family, to improve their nation, right? And when you're trying to act with beneficence towards your family, towards your nation, out of loyalty, then that actually, I think, motivates you to improve them. But it does require that you'll set certain limits, right? So I think that's also you find in the Bible, that a nation can easily become what people think today is nationalism, which is you just prioritize your nation above all, right? And then they'll say, well, what's the difference between prioritizing your nation, being loyal to your nation, and just being a Nazi who wants to conquer the world, right? There's no difference. And I think that's the Bible teaches that there is a difference, right? You're told you need to improve your nation, but you also put clear borders around you need to improve your nation, not just by trying to conquer by conquering others, but by improving internally. That's the model. So loyalty doesn't mean make yourself and yours the most powerful. Loyalty means improve that by putting limits where you say, we're not trying to conquer the world. We're really trying to make ourselves the best that we can be. So yeah, there's a lot more to talk about the Bible, but I think that if you're going to talk about, we may need to go back to some kind of traditions in order to refine loyalty. I think that's true. I think that's part of my motivation, is that I think that the problem is that really that story that we were talking about, the story that we tell, that we're all individuals who are trying to calculate for ourselves what's best for ourselves as individuals. That's the political theory part of it, but it also has an epistemological aspect to this. And this is where I said that maybe we would become too philosophical, that the Enlightenment taught that each individual can figure out what's best for themselves and what is completely moral and completely right on their own. And that's why we've been cut off from these traditions. That's why people don't learn the Bible in the university, and they don't go to the church in order to figure out what kind of good person they want to be. And instead they people still need guidance. They still want answers. So they go to Peter Singer, But I think that there's an alternative. Well, you tell me if you want to go into the epistemology, but I think that there's an alternative epistemology that says, look, moral and political questions are very difficult to answer, and it takes generations to find answers to those questions. It's true that each individual may have a perspective, may have something to add that's indispensable, right? And therefore, I don't think that just to say, well, whatever my tribe is saying is just right, is the way to achieve truth, because I think that individuals will see things that other people haven't seen. They will realize that something is wrong in a way that nobody has before. I think that does happen. Human beings have the capacity for that. But at the same time, I think that our ability to figure out what's right is also so limited to a particular lifespan of, not that many years. And as we were saying before, I mean, even just in your own lifetime, when you're young, you think, oh, making money and looking good is all you really need in order to have a good life. And then when you're 50 or 60, it turns out your perspective is very different on what actually makes your life good. If you didn't have children by the time you're 60, you may really regret it, right? So even Plato says, look, being just is not about it's not about what seems to you right in the moment, right? So, but the Enlightenment thinks that, okay, maybe in the span of your life, you can still figure out what's best for human beings, what's really moral, what's really politically salient. And Hume makes the argument that you can't figure out what's just in one generation, right? So he gives the example of private property, that in our family environments, we often don't have private property. And there's a suggestion that says, well, we could just extend that to all of society, right? All of human beings should just not have private property. And Hume says that it's only because we've seen what societies look like when they impose laws and take on laws of private property, because we see from generation to generation that benefits society as a whole, that we even know that private property is beneficial, right? So he's arguing with someone like Locke, who will say, well, it's self-evident. Every individual at all times will be able to figure out for themselves, if they're just thinking rationally, that private property is just. And Hume says, no, it takes generations to figure out that living according to a rule that says to each their own, private property is sacred. Like, to see that that's beneficial, it takes a few generations to see that. So I think that if you think of moral and political questions in this way, where you think you really need perspective of generations to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what's beneficial, what's not beneficial, then you think very differently about epistemology with regard to moral and political questions. You think it's not every individual, wherever they are, will just see self-evident truths that are moral or political. And I think that if that's the way you think about how we learn what's right and wrong, that we need this accumulated knowledge over a few generations that looks at consequences of actions and consequences of laws over generations, then you suddenly start thinking very differently about tradition. Then it turns out that to cut ourselves off from the Bible, which is a book that tells us about human experience, about our nation's experience, for over the span of 1,000 years, right? It makes you realize what a huge leap forward you have if you're starting off of 1,000 years of your nation's experience with certain laws, rather than saying, no, I'm just going to start from scratch. I'm going to start from nothing, right? And I'm just going to figure out for myself what's moral. I'm not saying you can't figure out anything, but I also think that you're kind of shooting yourself in the leg. Like, you're starting behind. And that's, I think, if you're suggesting, like, look, people maybe have something in the churches that they miss, that there's this loyalty that they could regain by going back to the church. I think that's true. And I think that there's a lot more that can be learned, not only from the structure of the buildings, from the texts themselves. And one thing that I think that we learn is the benefits of loyalty. But I think there's a lot more. I think there's a lot of things that if you're coming at the Peter Singer, I can all figure this out. Like, I love it that he talks about biting the bullet every time that he has like a strong intuition that he knows that people will feel uncomfortable with his theory. He's like, well, bite the bullet, go against your intuition. And I'm saying, no, that intuition comes from somewhere. You were raised in a particular way. Your society thinks in a certain way. Now, that's not everything, right? Your society could be wrong about something. You could have been raised in a way that was wrong. But there's also a lot you probably, as an 18 or 20 or even 60-year-old, haven't yet figured out. And there's a lot to gain from building on. That's, I think, the epistemological aspect. So if you think that human beings learn things through tradition, then I think loyalty plays a very central role. That if you think that the way we learn morality is by looking at our experiences over generations, then saying, I do this because this is the way my family has done it. I do this because this is the way my tradition teaches to do it. That's an epistemological plus rather than epistemological loss, in my view. But it really boils down to, how do you think we learn about morality?
Okay, well, it seems like I pressed a few buttons unwittingly when I mentioned Singer, but There are so many.
Even though I admire him, I really do admire him that he is able to give people guidance in a place where people really want it. I admire that.
Yeah, there are so many things that we can talk about. Well, several things that came to mind as you were talking, but we should really be wrapping up. But I'll just mention them briefly. You spoke about how King David is mentioned in the Bible as loyal, right? Which is kind of weird, like because I guess that's one of the big revolutions of monotheism in a sense. Because why would King David need to be loyal? He's the king. Like you should be loyal to him. And also you've mentioned that a community shouldn't be conquering, it should be focusing on itself or something like that, some sort of atomistic approach that like every nation or every community has its own unique unit. And that actually made me think of Marcus Aurelius, but instead of having the person as the unit, you have the community as the unit. Now we still have I guess there's still
a unit
a lot
of improvement. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So I guess there's still a lot to talk about with regards to which exactly is the proper unit to be loyal to and in what context. But I guess that's not something that we'll get to today. So that's about it for today. Is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap this up? This has been a terrific conversation for me, to be honest. I see myself, well, it feels kind of stupid to say, but I see myself primarily as a philosopher. So that's like my main interest, even though I'm not really good at it. So that has been a terrific conversation for me. Is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap this up?
I think it'll be too long if I wanted to add something.
Okay, yeah, you do have a lot to say, and that's been great. So thank you so much, Avital, and I hope you guys viewing and listening have enjoyed and gotten some value out of this conversation. And thank you. I'll see you in the future.